Computer. Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Christian Sullivan. I am a second grade teacher at a Christian school in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I am just delighted to be able to interview Dr. David Bentley Hart. Now, who is Dr. David Bentley Hart? For those of you who might not know, I believe if my chronology is correct, Dr. David Bentley Hart became kind of known in the English-speaking world in 2003 with the publication of his amazing book, The Beauty of the Infinite. Many writers spend their entire lives and never even come close to writing something as wide and deep as this book. But after that, Dr. Hart continued to produce amazing works such as The Doors of the Sea, The Experience of God. He's produced a number of essays. He writes on topics ranging as far as baseball to Japanese aesthetics. But perhaps the best thing about Dr. Hart's writing is his children's literature and his love for children's literature. I first came across his children's literature when I saw that he had published a book in 2019 called The Mystery of Castle MacGorilla. Now, as a second grade teacher, I am very hard on books, especially when it comes to literature for my students, because we only have a certain amount of time in the day. But when I began reading this book to my class, they absolutely fell in love with it. This became the book that they remember the entire year. They would ask for this book for Christmas. They would talk about this book. They would ask, can we read more? Can we read another chapter? What's going to happen? And so I wanted just to interview and ask Dr. Hart about children's literature in general. And for one, thank him for writing this book and also for writing a sequel. I had no idea whether or not they would be following the story of Teddy Porcelina, if I'm correctly pronouncing it.
Porcelina, yes.
With a C that's making the S sound. And of course, everyone's probably favorite, the beloved gorilla, or Gorgor, as he is affectionately known by his friends. So Dr. Hart, thank you very much for taking this time.
Well, thanks for having me. I have to point out that the two children's books, of course, are co-written by my son because they began as games we played when he was very small. And in fact, the first book, which was published many years after it was written, I wrote with him when he was 11. So.
Oh my goodness! So this is a long time in coming. So then,
yeah, but the sequel, yeah, now he's 24. So
okay, and so
it was a very different experience writing the second one together, but it was still based in games we had played back when he was, I don't know, 6 or 7.
That's amazing. Yeah. So one of the things that I've noticed as a teacher, especially a teacher of young children developing a love of literacy, is that great children's literature tends to have a few things in common. One of them is the children love it. And that's something that the Mystery of Castle MacGorilla in your writing has. But another is that adults love it. A great thing. So tell me about when you were young, what was your first experience or overture toward literature? When did you realize that you loved to read? Was it stories from your mother that she read to you, or were you just naturally a reader, from the moment you were able to read?
I don't remember learning to read. It's always, that's the funny thing. It's just was always there. So obviously it happened very early. I had older siblings too, who were significantly older, 9 and 7 years. So I wasn't just being read to by my parents, but also by my brothers. And I was always reading along. So, the book was always, and very early on, I think, probably my eldest brother, Addison, when I was very small, read me Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which remain among my favorite books. I mean, books that I reread almost yearly. So I suppose that has a privileged place, but also The Wind in the Willows came very early, the Winnie the Pooh books. I mean, basically the great British canon of children, because, of course, Britain, but England in particular, has produced the best modern tradition of children's literature by leagues and leagues and fathoms and fathoms. I mean, no other nation has a comparable genius, or at least during that period. I mean, the middle of the 19th through the middle of the 20th century for children's books.
And so when your brother first read to you Alice in Wonderland, what did that do to your imagination? How did that inspire you to?
Well, again, I mean, you're speaking about something that happened at such an early age that I have no early. Thank you. I have no. Or speaking of my son, he just brought me some water. Um, I have no earlier memory uh, than that, other than being a very small child playing with. But it came so very early in my development that I've just always inhabited that world. It's like asking me what was it like being a protoplasm or a single cell in the mother's womb. I just don't have a sharp recollection of
Well,
it.
I mean, not everyone's memory is as bright as others. No, no, that makes sense. I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a few years at which I had, I was decorated my class to be similar to Alice in Wonderland, um,
Oh, good
and
for you.
we had something in Knoxville called the Fantasy of Trees, where many different Christmas trees are decorated, and one of the families purchased a tree for me in my class that was entirely decorated as Alice in Wonderland. So it was a nice book and one that's dear to my heart as well. Wind in the Willows. Tell me about a little bit about that book. What was it about that has connected with you? And when was the last time you read it? And which is your favorite version of it? Because there's a lot of great illustrations. There's a new one, I believe, in 2022 with Chris Dunn doing illustrations, which is
Yeah,
very
no, that's one of the interesting differences as children's books go, because the first edition was not illustrated. I mean, Alice and Through the Looking Glass is an incomplete book if you have anything other than John Tenniel's illustrations. Occasionally, somebody produces other illustrations, and that's interesting enough. But that should never be the only copy of the book you have. If you don't have the John Tenniel illustrations, you don't have the complete book. And of course, Lewis Carroll collaborated on how they should look. If you see some of the sketches he himself did for the illustrations, you see they're very close to what John Tenniel produced. So they're part of. And the same is true. You need Ernest Shepard's illustrations for Winnie the Pooh, for the Winnie the Pooh books. And when we were when we were very young, and now we are six, and Winnie the Pooh and the House at Pooh Corner again. That's part of the text. That's why listening to them, for instance, on Audible doesn't quite do it. But The Wind in the Willows is special because it's the book has inspired any number of brilliant illustrators, and I go, I can't even remember all the names of them because I've seen many have been very good. Occasionally, some we can do without. I was always very fond of, but not necessarily convinced that they were ideal, the illustrations of Arthur Rackham, the great Arthur Rackham. So, for now, let's put those first. I mean,
and chapter 7, the infamous chapter 7 of Pan and that. Have you
is it infamous?
Have you any thoughts on those books that omit chapter 7?
Now, are you using the word infamous correctly there?
I mean, I think it's rather infamous if you take out a chapter of the book just because, well, the children might not understand it. So I know a number of copies.
Yes, well, that is an infamy. I'll say that.
That is a number. I've always, as a teacher, I can say that children are much more intelligent than adults give them credit for it. So when you pull out a chapter because the adults might not understand it, that's.
Well, I mean, read The Wind in the Willows. Read the prose in it. Absolutely nothing is held back. I mean, that's prose that would adorn a very sophisticated adult novel. Mm. Or another children's book that's similar in that regard, Watership Down. Mm. You will find that even very small children. I mean, it never occurred to me at the age of 7, say, that the book was too hard for me. Mm-hmm. There were words I didn't necessarily know, and so I asked what they meant. But even so, I was able to follow the story, and as a result, learned a great deal about the English language tacitly while I was learning what was happening to Toad and Badger and Ratty and Mola.
Yes. I introduced that Wind the Willows this past year to a friend of mine who had sadly he was a studied playwriting in Romania for a little while, and I never read The Wind of the Willows, and he and I were talking about it, and he he appreciated it, but he didn't quite have the same exuberance or delight that I had with it. I said, well, read it again next year. I think once you've gone through it once and you know what happens, you can appreciate it. And one of the things that I appreciated between
To me, that's like seeing the face of God and saying, "I feel disappointed." I mean, it's just some people you can't under. Yeah.
Not a lumen gloria quite yet. One of the things that I appreciated, though, I connected. Maybe this was just in my mind, or you tell me if I'm reading it correctly. But one of the things that I seem to notice. Let's get into your book, the Mystery of Castle MacGorilla. That sort of mirrors nicely The Wind in the Willows. Is friendship. It seems that in both books there is, and obviously this was written then when your son was 11, so it's a long time since then. But it seems that the book was written, as I read it and as I read it to my students, it seemed like it was just having fun, like it was just a playful experience, delighting in friendships between these characters, and that there was just a beating heart of delight behind the whole thing, like all of the events that seem to just be enraptured in delight. Is that kind of the experience that you had writing it? Am I picking up
Oh yeah.
correctly?
I mean, well, if you write a book with your 11-year-old son, it's about as delightful an experience as you can have. Now, writing a book with your 24-year-old son is an enjoyable experience in another regard. One is you can leave more of the prose up to him. I mean, it reads like me, but to be honest, in part that's because his prose style and mine are sufficiently similar that I myself, in some passages, can't remember who came up with that sentence and who didn't. Um, but yeah, I mean, to me, it was just sheer delight. The funny thing, yeah, it's very hard now to publish children's books that haven't been run through a kind of filter. I mean, for one thing, The Wind in the Willows couldn't get published now because it said, well, this is too difficult for the very young. It's not just adults, but the publishing industry and even the children's books publishing industry that now takes it as doctrine that children are basically stupid and incurious. I know you haven't read The Mystery of the Green Star, you'll see again, we don't tailor the language to some ideal inarticulate small child. Mm. We write it, well, as I like to think Kenneth Graham wrote, with the sense that if the story is good and the characters are delightful and it's funny, and I do think that both books are very funny, funny enough both for the adults and for the children, that the children will enjoy it enough to pick up the language as they go along. And that's how one learns to be a real reader, is early exposure. I mean, children's minds is not just their imaginations, but as you know, their capacity for language is so vast as compared to ours when we age. I mean, in those first few years of life, the more you can pour in, do so, they can take it. I mean, they can absorb so much. I mean, you realize that a 3-year-old can be raised in a trilingual family and be equally fluent in say, Chinese, English, and French. And to think of a little girl I know is the daughter of a friend of mine. In later life, you can acquire other language, but it's rare that you can achieve absolute fluency the way a small child can. And the same is true. So don't, do not. But it was very difficult. I mean, I knew that the first book, I mean, we tried. My agent went around to the regular suspects, and they all had these sort of editorial boards that said, no, it has to be pitched according to, our categories, 2 to 4, 4 to 7, 7 to 12, and certain sorts of words can be used, certain sorts of sentences. And, and always when you looked at the standards by which they worked, it was pretty cretinizing. I mean, it was basically, they didn't mind, for instance, writing for children using bad grammar as long as it was so simple and, so we set the book aside, and that's why there were so many years between the writing of it and the publishing of it. It was only, as you see, it was published by, Angelico is an independent press, and they don't feel they have to obey any particular set of confining rules. And The result was the happiest experience in my life as a writer has been the praise I've received from children. I mean, through their parents sometimes, but from them directly. I mean, there's something really extraordinarily satisfying in being told by a 9-year-old that she loved your book so much she read it 3 times.
Mm.
That's the highest accomplishment I can imagine, because it's not easy to write for children, especially if you're not following the formula of trying to write down to children, which one should never do.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I've come across, and those who are in my field of work, educating young minds, is we want children to read, but what's being produced is, man cannot live on Captain Underpants alone. We must have something.
I don't know what
substance.
That is, so please don't tell me.
Exactly what you had mentioned. It's cotton candy. It's bad grammar. It's silliness. It's a story. It's comic story for kids, and kids will end up reading them, but it's not something that will nourish your imagination or nourish your soul.
I also think you should nourish their sense of humor. Correct. I have to say this: that making jokes for children at an infantile level is wrong. Being silly in a way they can understand, but in a way also that will make an adult laugh, is what you should be doing, because as much as our imaginations need to be formed, so too do our senses of humor.
And when you come to, one of the things that was, and this was actually surprising for me, is, there's the concept and humor of the running gag, and it can get stale after a while, where you see the same thing over and over again. But one of the things that I've found delightful is that
can't get his attention
in the Mystery of Castle MacGorilla, is that poor Selina's continual use of different foods as exclamations was just endlessly entertaining to the kids, especially when I read it, and the voices that I would use. But she'd be like, crumpets and pastries, and all the kids would just giggle with delight when all the different things that she had, and
none that pedestrian though. They're better than that.
Probably.
Oh, they should. She doesn't go for abstractions like pastries,
Yeah, no, yeah, it was probably a little bit more specific, like marmalade sandwiches or something.
But yeah, well, I mean, another thing is many editorial boards wouldn't allow that now, because they claim you were making joke of an eating disorder or something. But they're missing the point. I mean, she's a toy pig, and so she has toy characteristics, but also she's sweet and brave and loves her friends, and she's not a glutton. She simply is playing the role that fate has assigned her as a toy pig. But yeah, I mean, the things that children again understand, they get the joke, and you don't have to make it stupid to amuse them. But the funny thing is, you asked about the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and I immediately went off on a divagation here, so I never answered that. So, what exactly were you asking? Because I was called on the word infamous, but I mean, I say the famous, and for some, deeply incomprehensible. I mean, I don't get that. If you remove, there are 2 chapters that people routinely remove from The Wind in the Willows when they're doing a sort of abridged readings for children or readings for small. Kuiper at the Gates of Dawn, and the one in which Ratty conceives the desire to go explore the world, to sail away. Suddenly I've lost, it has the word ahoy in the chapter, and suddenly I forget how I can forget a book I read every year. Just shows you once you get old, everything is up for grabs. And both chapters were, it's true, written separately from the main narrative. He put them in. He wrote the main narrative, and then he wrote them and put them in.
Yeah.
But as a child,
it's not Wind in the Willows without it. It's
not. I mean,
we could say it's similar to the woman caught in adultery in the Gospel of John. It wasn't in the original one, but it has to be in there.
Yeah. No, I mean, the thing is, I mean, the reason he put them in is, and the reason he waited to write them is because he had an inspiration. He realized this story, there was a depth in this story that he was aware of that needed to be brought out. and to withhold that from children, I mean, that's the most mysterious and imaginative and delightful. Well, both of them are. I mean, especially Piper at the Gates of Dawn is as a small child, it wakens you to so much, and it gives the book a depth and a beauty, but also a different kind of playfulness, without which you've never really experienced The Wind in the Willows, which, it's like saying you've never experienced the Iliad or something. I mean, it's a severe cultural deprivation not to have, not fully to have experienced that book. And you can pity, other peoples who don't read English as their first language because they can't read Shakespeare, Lewis Carroll, or The Wind in the Willows in the original.
Mm.
I mean, for all the beauties of their own languages and literatures.
Yeah, I see that you've omitted Milton. Is Milton not in your?
Oh, Milton too. But Milton, look, I mean, as Milton's all in the sublime style. That's a very different experience. I mean, there are all sorts of great experiences that are possible only in the language. I mean, there has never been and will never be a decent translation of the Aeneid, because the story itself isn't good enough. To be honest, I mean, it's not like the Iliad or the Odyssey, where a good translation, it's not going to match the Greek. You're not going to get the minine, the othia, the rolling thunder, especially if you pronounce the Greek correctly.
My father is fluent in Greek and Hebrew, but unfortunately, he had never passed that on to me. So I have an appreciation of people who can do that, and I can hear some things. I'm like, oh, that I think that's that word maybe sometimes, but unfortunately, I have none of the ability to fully appreciate that.
But also, I insist on pronouncing it with the Demotic accent, because I think the Erasmian ruins the sound and doesn't correspond to the way Greek was ever taught. That the Demotic's probably much closer to the way Homeric Greek would have sounded. Not exactly the same, but closer.
You had mentioned English literature.
But no, I think I will say about Milton is that Milton, I mean, and Borges has once made this point very good with Milton. It's magnificent and stirring in the way that Virgil is in the Aeneid, but it is all in the sublime style. With Shakespeare, the difference is you have everything. I mean, the whole spectrum of the English language. I reread A Midsummer Night's Dream every year, because the entire history of English poetry, both before and after Shakespeare is present, not only is there all the, everything leading up through to the late 16th and early 17th century in English prosody, but somehow you have all of Romanticism and modernism in there too, because, so that's the difference. I just mean that there are certain, certain things that can't even be analogized in other languages.
Well, the now deceased literary critic Harold Bloom had written about
I knew him.
Which some people have different opinions on him. So I
got to know him personally in the later years, and he
said that Shakespeare had invented the human. He invented the human, and so in some sense, I have a deep appreciation for Shakespeare because of getting to see him through the eyes of somebody who's like, wow, this Shakespeare tells us a lot more than you get in high school when you just have to read.
Well, I mean, you just read the drama of his time. Christopher Marlowe is the most impressive earlier figure, but Ben Jonson of his time were just around him, and you realize something epochal has happened. I mean, something's very different. It's not just the range of linguistic power, which is absolutely uncanny. I mean, it goes beyond what language you normally think can do at times, but it's also that character personality is present in the plays in a degree that's just unprecedented in any drama. You can point to classical or golden age. I mean, you don't find it in Calderon, you don't find it in Racine. Their characters are lively and real, but they're still constrained in a way that lacks all the sort of psychological nuances that just overflow in Shakespeare. And you realize something happened there. So, I mean, I happen to agree that Harold was onto something
He's onto
that
something.
yeah, yeah. I have my problems with some of his, I mean, everyone does. I mean, but with it, it's 50-50. I love some stuff. I hate some stuff. I really got to like him when we became friends. So,
Yeah, well, I remember reading his book, The Western Canon, and that was a fun
well, it's a
read.
fun book, it's like, you should like Nabokov more, Harold, yeah.
You
But
mentioned,
back to but Piper of the Gates of Dawn. Yeah,
okay,
well,
Piper of the Gates of Dawn. Yeah.
it's central to my sensibility. It's central to my philosophy. In my book Roland and Moonlight, I mean, you might mention that I also write uh, adult fiction, and that which is everything. It's fiction and memoir and
How is
essay
Roland?
and
Is he in well
poetry.
health? Good health?
Yeah, he's going on 14, which
Okay.
is very
That
elderly for a dog, but
that is the age of my dog as well. So
yeah, but
they
he's
were
is very vigorous for his age. I'm very pleased. I just keep my fingers crossed and my prayers ascending that he stays healthy for as long as possible. Because the vet, just but based on his weight years ago, not that he was overweight. I mean, based on his weight class,
Mhm.
said all dogs of this size usually live around 11 years. But I mean, he seems to be unaware of that, so he just keeps going on and on. He's still dashing around the garden and playing.
Sounds good. And has he ever made his journey to with Addison to Norway, or is he
No, no, no,
never
no.
gonna he's never gonna run to that
He
one?
decided against that. He figured, well, for one thing, he's devoted to my wife to an almost fanatical degree, and I just don't think he thinks that we would look after her well enough in his absence, either me or when my son's over.
Yes.
So it's uh so yeah, and I think he doesn't say it, but I think he doesn't really think I can be trusted on my own. So,
Well, I mean, it's good to have a companion who can look
the
out.
funny thing, though, is in a sense that's a kind of children's book too. I mean, it's a children's book sensibility for someone like me who's never really grown up. He's just acquired more capacity for ideas and for knowing how to write heroic couplets and things like that. But I like to think that at the heart of that book, that novel, memoir, treatise, whatever it is, that florilegium of philosophy, is a children's book, essentially. I mean, it's about a talking dog, for God's sake.
It is, yes, that is. I mean, but shouldn't all the best books be about that? I mean, we have so few. We have so few that are.
That's my one problem with the Bible. There just aren't enough talking
There aren't
dogs.
enough.
There's
So
one,
we do
one
get
talking,
a donkey,
one
but it's
talking
just
ass.
not.
Yeah, right.
It's not quite the same. But
Still
yeah,
one
no,
of the
chapter
best
seven.
moments.
Chapter seven. We might never get to chapter seven. Chapter seven. No, I was saying infamous in the sense that I find it. I think it's very very sad when books omit the chapter, because for good children's literature, I feel like you shouldn't at least explain everything. You have to leave them with a sense of wonder that there is more to discover in the world, and
Yeah.
that this world that you've entered is much bigger than what the author has relayed to you.
And do not limit them. Do not condescend to what you assume is their capacity, because the capacity that children have is a capacity for capacity,
Mm.
which is also a good definition of genius in a sense. So every child, in a sense, that's allowed to be is a kind of natural genius, because he or she can absorb things at a rate and with a fullness that those of us who have fallen into adulthood, because it is a kind of fall, can't match. So what children have is a capacity for acquiring capacity. So there's do not limit them. The Mystery of the Green Star has phrases in French in it, I should warn you, and things like that.
I've found them. My wife lived in France for a year teaching art, a little way outside of Paris, and I believe it was a town called Le Chèvre. I believe, if I'm pronouncing that right, something about goats. I can't remember.
Yes, chef.
But yeah,
Yes.
yeah, but yeah. So she will definitely have to help me with the French pronunciation with that when I read to my class.
Très facile. I mean, it's just like simple phrases that you should, like, je suis très heureux de faire votre connaissance, I mean, that sort of things. But, and then there is some, I couldn't forbear to do this. I did write 8 lines of French classical Alexandrines in it just to show that I could, but I give a translation too. So,
It's
if
very,
you,
very generous of you.
If you read that book to your class as well, let me know if they respond to it as well as they did, as happily as they did to the first one, because I think it's every bit as funny.
Yeah.
But because there's some French scattered through again, you would have had the editorial boards. I know you can't. Yeah, sorry.
These kids. When I was talking to our reading specialist at the school, one of the things that I had mentioned to her, and she's been reading The Mystery of Castle MacGorilla, and seeing what is this? Could we use this for like an advanced reading level? One of the things that she had mentioned, or I'd mentioned to her, is that this is the type of book that you don't get anymore, because the amount of just education a child will get from here is just you're going to learn history. You're going to learn about the Scottish Highland ranks, a laird. You're going to be exposed to a type of education that you don't get with the average book that you will pull off of the shelf at Barnes and Noble.
It is my hope that, I mean, that was my experience of the good children's books that I read as a child. One of the books I especially loved as a child, of course, was Martin Gardner's Annotated Alice. Because, of course, I learned a lot from Alice. I mean, I had to ask, questions about terms and the jokes I didn't get that did have to be explained to me. But when they were explained to me, because I was young, they were fixed. One of my, I think is, one of the silliest and best lines in Through the Looking Glass is at the end when Alice has been formally introduced to the mutton, and she wants to know from the Red Queen if she can take a slice, and the Red Queen says, "Of course not. It's not etiquette to cut someone to whom you've been properly introduced." Well, of course, the notion of the cut is not part of our culture anymore. The cut direct, the cut indirect, the cut celestial, the cut infernal. But once it was explained to me, and I got the joke, even as a child, there were other references that I didn't get from my brothers, but that Martin Gardner, and there were 3 editions of that. I think I've always made sure that I have a copy of the Annotated Alice in its final version. Yeah, no, I mean, my hope is, and I hope in the Green Star too, I mean, they'll be hearing about Bonaparte in passing. They won't, it's like, but know what a chateau is and other things, and little bits of history and art. I don't know. That was my experience as a child. And I do worry that, worry? I just think, the children's literature we produce today is of another kind, and it seems to be designed not to give children more than what they already have, but in fact to try to confine them in as small a corner of the imagination as they can. I mean, I have looked, and that's not true of all. I mean, there's still some, I've come across 1 or 2 children's writers who of course, my mind now being what it is now, of course, names.
I would just say, if you have to tell me as a teacher of second graders, I need to know these names. One that I do think of that's a really good modern children's book is The Mysterious Benedict Society by Trenton Lee Stewart. I'm not sure.
I mean, that's pretty good. Yeah, I mean, I thought that had a lot going for it. I like that better than. I mean, I do read children's literature because, as I said, I'm an overgrown child. But and that's why. I mean, if in my philosophical or theological work there's any sign of an imaginative intellect, it's because I've never. I like to think never suppressed the child playfulness in my character, but I mean, not to flatter myself, but I like that better than, say, a series of unfortunate events, which got kind of formulaic and wasn't as clever as it wanted to be, but also had, was better than average. Let me put it that way. So it's not. And I'm trying to remember who the author is of the novel, The Girl Who Drank the Moon. I thought that wasn't bad at all. So there are still, I mean, it's not, but there's nothing like The Wind in the Willows appearing.
Nothing quite
like the Alice books. There's nothing that's that well. The Alice books, I mean, it's just there's an insanity in them, a sort of British and controlled insanity. is something. One of the great paradoxes of the English character. Again, English, not British. So I don't mean Welsh. I don't mean Scots. I mean English. Is this curious dissociative personality disorder that runs through the whole culture, in which they're once the most whimsical and imaginative culture on earth. The wildest comedy, the most imaginative and delightful children's literature, or the most desiccated, analytic, unimaginative. I mean, there's, you can't. It's hard to believe that the same people who produced Lewis Carroll produced A.J. Ayer. And yet it's just a fact of history. And what makes it interesting is only England could have produced either of them. Each is so extreme an example of what he was that it's unimaginable that they could have been the cultural products of anything else. So anyway, or Richard Dawkins. I mean, the man cannot think because he cannot imagine. I mean, even his scientific work is third tier because he's always looking for a simple linear narrative, genetocentric neo-Darwinism, which has been basically disproved by 70 or 80 years of better evolutionary theory and better molecular
Dr. Hart, are you trying to tell me that you were not enraptured with the selfish gene, that your soul did not ascend?
It was a proto-fascist book written in defense of a scientific theory that had been more or less discredited 30 years before it appeared by Barbara McClintock.
It was a theory in search of a fact, as you might say.
It was. But
you had mentioned, and I.
But it's a great straw man. I mean, it's great because you don't need a straw man because of it. Yeah.
You had mentioned, and I don't want to trespass upon your time, so please tell me whenever you need to go. But I did want you had mentioned British literature as being the gold standard of children's literature. I agree, but I do want to make a mention of something and tell me your thoughts. The Happy Prince.
Oh, the Little Prince. You mean?
So the Little Prince. I'm sorry.
You
yes,
mean
Little Prince.
surely,
I was mixing Oscar Wilde's Happy Prince with the Little Prince.
But I knew what you meant because, of course, Oscar Wilde, though he was part Irish, was basically an English writer, so he fits into this category. A little bit too saccharine in the fairy tales, but then he could always give you the twist that made the saccharine bitter, like what's the one about the scholar who wants the red rose and for his love?
Oh, is that in the Happy Prince?
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
And the little little sparrow. There is a little child next to the fire. Please go pluck out one of my eyes.
It's the piercing her heart in order for the blood to stain the rose, and then at the end, the woman is, I don't care for roses. She likes jewelry, so he throws it away.
Yes. Yeah,
but anyway, the Little Prince is a masterpiece. I didn't want to give the impression that other nations haven't produced great children's literature. They have, and there are other great examples of French children's books. And actually, I kind of tend to think that the symbolist period in French literature was a kind of displaced children's literature in some ways. Le Petit Prince, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, is a great book. I love it. Its sensibility is a little off if you're from an Anglophone culture, but it fits perfectly within a certain French tradition of fable and fairy tale. But it's also, of course, a brilliant little Gnostic parable that is sort of Christian Gnostic, or Gnostic Christian, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, but it definitely is on the border there.
And then there is Madeline, the Madeline stories, which are also of French extract, but just I think a very fun and delightful.
They're good. They're enjoyable. Yes. So I even like.
If you can write a story about appendicitis,
Enda's The Never-Ending Story was Enda, the Never-Ending Story was. Even Germans can write children's literature.
Well, the Grimm's fairy tales
Well,
I'm a bit dark,
so,
so I don't read many of those to my second graders
yeah, I mean some of them, but I mean
I
those
prefer to
aren't
help
really for
keep their
children.
psyche in full healthy way. My wife is a mental health counselor, and so I try to make sure that my students have good mental health. So,
Though worse than Grimm, I would say. I mean, the Grimm brothers were just really they weren't really writing for children so much as they were compiling folklore,
mhm.
and they're uh, so that the children's versions of the stories that entered into popular culture are all somewhat expurgated. I mean, they have some of the horrific content, but not quite all of it. I mean,
Mhm.
the original death of Snow White's stepmother is a lot grislier.
Disney didn't really illustrate that quite to the same extent.
No, no. But far worse, actually, what I think you should try to spare children is Hans Christian Andersen.
Mm. I
Well,
remember reading a little bit of Hans Christian Andersen as a child. It gave me just a weird feeling, so
yeah,
I
no,
never.
I think there was a psychological disorder there that I don't really think there's. I mean, there's actually a far deeper cruelty in his imagination than there is in the folklore of the Grimm's brothers, which are pre-modern and a bit brutal and a bit and depict cruelty. But in Hans Christian Andersen, there's a streak of sadism that's palpable. So I don't. There's an example in the classic canon where I advise abstinence. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
An abstemious soul can be a good one. Well, before we jump off, I did want to tell you about one more book that you have written, and that would be Kino Gaia. Was that how you pronounce it? When I first saw it, I thought it would be Kenna Gaia, but
Kenno.
I've heard it both ways.
No, it's Kenno. It's
Kenna Gaia. Okay, kenosis.
the prefix. Yeah, the prefix in Greek has an epsilon, not an eta. So in if it had an eta in dematiki, it would be kinoyeia. But
So if I were as a
Kennegai.
teacher, I would say this would probably fall into the category of what we would classify as young adult fiction,
Yeah,
in the sense of that this is definitely not something that would be suitable in my mind for
not for second graders. No.
No, but it was something that I read it was it last year or was it 2 years ago? I can't remember whenever the publication date was. I read it, gave it to my wife, and she read it after. And it was a very unique experience. I never read a book quite like it. I know I'm familiar with Valentinian Gnosticism, so I picked up on your use of the Hymn of the Pearl, but it was I don't want to say transcendent because that's not the right word, but it was just it just took me into a world that felt very much like I had jumped up the neighborhood of reality into another bubble. And it was it was a very exciting and fun experience. So, you also write books that could be young adult fiction. Do you have any plans in the future to delve more into fiction, adult fiction, young adult
Oh,
fiction?
definitely. Look, I mean, the next book I have coming out is which I consider the best book of all my books I've written in any genre, with the possible exception of Roland and Moonlight, which I also is a collection of stories that actually is coming from University of Notre Dame Press. I didn't even know they had a fiction. It's funny, I'm here next. I didn't know they had a fiction line, but they do, and they've won some awards. But it's just not, it's not a big press. So you have to know, oh, that was actually published by UNDP, and they're bringing out a collection of stories. Adult fiction is actually the thing that, well, fiction in general is actually my primary interest. I got diverted onto other paths just because I needed to make a career, and it's very hard to make good money writing fiction unless you're like, unless it's bad, unless it's like George R. R. Martin, it's where the prose is.
But you don't want that on your soul.
I don't want it on my conscience, but I also you have to believe in it to write it. It's like some people say, well, maybe I could make some money by assuming a nom de guerre.
A nom de plume.
No, nom de guerre. Nom de plume is a fake. Nom de plume, I mean, that means name of the pen. Yeah. But the problem is that's not a real phrase in French. That's one that was invented. He said nom de guerre was always used also for pseudonyms, in literary pseudonyms as well. That's the actual Anyway, we don't need to get recherche about French. Okay.
Well, you would have me beat hands down. But yeah,
Uh,
so we're excited. Okay, does this have a title? Obviously, the publisher is the one who chooses the final title, but
no, no,
does it have
no,
a
no,
working
no.
title?
No, no. I mean, the only time that I've ever had a publisher, well, twice it's happened. I mean, I had Atheist Delusions was kind of, a book that I had called The Christian Revolution, but luckily that sold well enough that thereafter I've been pretty much on my own as far as titles go. The Doors of the Sea had a subtitle attached to it that I didn't like, but
Mm-hmm.
that again was early on. Now, no, it's just called Prisms Veils,
Okay.
Prisms, comma Veils, um, and the title comes from a long quotation in French that appears at the beginning from a thoroughly fictional poet. This is my own creation, but that's never said in the book. But yeah, no, that's kind of, and more and more, if I have uh, more and more years to go, I could be hit by a meteor tomorrow, but that's where most of my energy will be going. I'm sort of wrapping up the other. I mean, I have some lectures to deliver in Cambridge in the spring. That'll be my last volume of theology. I don't mean I won't write the occasional essay or something, but I have no interest in writing more theological books. And
Is this the book about consciousness that you're referring to?
no, that's coming out from Yale next year too. That's on mind, life, and language, and that is the one where the title was proposed to me by my editor.
Mm-hmm.
All things are full of gods. It's Thales, but it was that's one of the epigraphs at the beginning. But originally, I just called it Psyche or Psyche because it's written as a long Platonic dialogue, and the main character is the goddess Psyche, or the erstwhile human, now goddess.
And
Psyche.
obviously, you will be dedicating this book to Daniel Dennett,
I am, yes.
as is only proper. So
Oh, yeah, there's something about it. There's someone who probably should
I'm
have
sorry.
gotten
I shouldn't be goading you out of this.
No, no, no. It's actually germane to the conversation because there's someone who really should have had more good children's literature poured into him as a child, I think, because he suffers from a deficit of imagination that is also a definite deficit of rational capacity.
Hmm.
He's an incredibly intelligent man. That I've never denied. It's not like Dawkins. He's not that bright. I mean, he's brighter than the average toadstool, but he's not. He's not a genius. He's not a great scientist. He's definitely not a great thinker. He's not even really that good a writer, though he's gotten a reputation for it. With Dennett, yeah, you can see the problem. I mean, Dennett's a very bad writer. I mean, that's not. But he's very
He can write long
intelligent.
books, though. He can
He
write a
can
long
write
book.
well, yeah. And my book from Yale is too long too, perhaps. But I'm afraid the topic makes one do that because I discovered that on this topic more than any other, you constantly have to repeat a point, even in print. If you don't, as you move from topic to topic, people will then shift back to the position that you've already dealt with because it's an oscillation between, just I'm getting out of the, but between among materialists, between strict emergentists and strict reductionists, with the occasional panpsychist, materialist panpsychist thrown. So you have to repeat yourself. But that's not the problem. With Dennett, though, there's something defective in the way he sees reality. It has no dimensions. It has no colorations. So my friend Ian McGilchrist would say, it's all left hemispheric. He
The
can
Master
only
and His
see
Emissary.
through,
Are you referring to
huh?
The Master and His Emissary?
Yeah, and his more recent big book. Again, I'm horrible with titles these days, but yeah,
Is it the thing about things or something to that effect?
The Matter of Things.
Matter of Things. Okay, I knew there were things in the book. Well, as you're saying that, what came to my mind is
I think that's it. The Matter of Things. Now I might have gotten that wrong. If so, I'm
there's
sorry.
something about things in there. So Google, everyone who's watching, Google Ian McGilchrist things, and you'll.
But
As you're saying that, it reminded me of C.S. Lewis's quotation where I believe where he was talking about how when he read um, George MacDonald, how he said it baptized his imagination. It baptized
Yeah.
his imagination, and there's a certain sense I think in which at least from a Christian perspective, that the more we draw close to Christ and the gospel, the more we begin to see things as they truly are. We see ourselves for who we are, and we begin to see the world in a way that we couldn't without that.
Can I tell you something, though? And this goes back to you mentioning the woman taken in adultery in the Gospel of John. Is a healthy immersion in good children's literature early on is a very good guide to how to read, say, the Gospels.
Hmm.
I mean, we live in America. Where are you? Did you say Tennessee?
Knoxville, Tennessee. So if you're ever in Knoxville,
There's plenty of white evangelical fundamentalism in the world around you of the sort that really is just totally literalist and would be genuinely scandalized. If you say, well, look, the Gospels are literary texts. They're stories about Jesus. They're not simply documentary accounts of Jesus. The Gospel of John, I mean, Luke and Matthew contradict one another on the facts of when Jesus was born, and how. And John, clearly is not an historical account. But we make this distinction between strict history, strict reporting, and the imaginative world, and it's just alien to the way the entirety of ancient culture thought. Is that you couldn't? I mean, read Herodotus or Thucydides or Thucydides, if you want. Erasmian, not in non-Erasmian or in anyway, in demonic. Well, let's stick with Thucydides because people with Herodotus will just say father of lies, which is not fair. But that is about as rich and probably as penetratingly accurate an historical account of the Peloponnesian War as there could be. It's probably, in a sense, more accurate than what a modern historian with more documentary evidence would produce. Mm. Because there are certain things you can see only with the imagination. The figure of Christ in each of the Gospels is subtly different as a character. They're not psychological studies, but you create a holographic effect in which you see the effect of Christ in history, in a milieu, and every time people try to pin him down, try to create a historical reduction, it fails. Why? Because not the available evidence refuses to conform to it, but because the imaginative picture we have is probably rich enough that we can't fall prey to simplistic historicism. We can't fall prey. It must. If it's unprecedented, if it doesn't fit into a certain historical type, it can't have happened. Well, of course, history is nothing but novel events. I mean, that's what makes it history as opposed to physics. I mean, there was never a battle. There was never a battle like the Battle of Salamis before it happened. So but you don't go back and say, well, this is improbable. This is a mixture of different kinds of warfare that doesn't seem to make sense. Yeah. In the case of the figure of Christ, that sort of literary tact, that sort of literary sensibility was common to the ancient and even the medieval world of those who could read, in which you didn't have to say, well, this is the allegorical reading, that's not. And of course, with the Gospels, you're not reading exactly allegorically either, although Origen would allow allegory for parts of the New Testament, like Revelation. Is if you haven't had that kind of awakening of the imagination and recognize the imagination is a basic rational faculty. It allows you to see reality in the fullness of its dimensions before you make the stupid mistake of reductively trying to create an abstract paradigm of reality, in which case you end up with someone like Daniel Dennett, who thinks that you can literally deny qualitative intentional consciousness as what it is, sort of the semantics of experience, because you've come up with an abstract paradigm of functionalism for the brain, though the latter in no way could possibly yield the former.
Mm.
he can convince himself that the former is an illusory after effect of that because there's an inability to see the fullness of the thing
Mm. And it also
because
seems
he
like
has a
in that
thwarted, stunted, emaciated imagination. There
and
is
in
an
that perspective from that you're saying that he has, it seems to be that it's an imagination that has caved in on itself. That is, he can
right,
imagine that his own
right.
mind is just a
He can
product
fantasize. He
of
can,
that.
yeah,
So
he can
it's a very
fantasize.
dark picture of reality.
But delusion isn't imagination. I mean, delusion is what happens when the imagination has been effectively slain. You know, and you can no longer tell the difference between seeing the fullness of reality imaginatively and being trapped in a mirage of your own devising, which is also a product of your own will.
Mm.
One of the good things about a mind well informed by good children's literature also is it cannot mistake reality for the fabrication of its own. It cannot mistake fabrications of the will, of the private will, for reality. Let me put it that way. It doesn't posit because already the imagination has been broken open by the fantastic and the poetic and the evocative and the strange in a way that won't let it rest content with any reduction or with any sort of merely mechanical pliancy of the real before the projects of personal ego or the will. All of that's important. I mean, you cannot, I don't think there's, I'll say that every great philosopher, but also probably every truly great scientist, probably had a rich imaginative life as a child and probably was nourished on stories and poems and all sorts of games and that's reason should not be the analytic narrowing of our perspectives, but an immediate and this is why, for instance, Michael Pogliani is very good on what really happens when you acquire personal knowledge. He understands that there's a sort of this tacit grasp of the whole. And there are others who are even better than he is at pointing out that that grasp of the whole has to do with a sort of a prior hunger for everything, for the infinite, which as a child is all we are. I mean, we're just this absolute appetite for everything the world has to give us. And children's literature should always serve that appetite and invite it to grow.
Yeah, and I think as children's literature is, when you have good children's literature, it exposes children to the good, the true, and the beautiful in a way that is able to be digested, able to be added to their character in a certain way.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Hart,
and as you'll see in The Mystery of the Green Star, in the character of Auguste, the Emperor Penguin, who is a poetically listless and melancholy Bonapartist.
Is he the similar character as Cuddles was in the first?
Well, no, I mean none of these. I mean,
because Cuddles seemed a little bit like he just needed to talk some of his feelings out. He just had a lot of pent up issues.
Cuddles. Make sure people get that right
Cuddles.
With T, not
yes,
cuddles,
yes. Not
but cuddles,
not
as in cuttlefish.
He's a cuttlefish.
He's a cephalopod, so he's not actually a cuttlefish. He's a squid, but he's called. Well, actually, of course, the stupid jokes are some of my favorite in the original, like the parrot whose last is Alistair Mac. Yes, that's a stupid joke.
Raquel de Raccooning.
Yes, Raccooning. Yes,
he was Raccooning the starlet whose Teddy is a bit smitten by. If a teddy bear could blush, I suppose that his fur would be getting a little red.
They can blush. This is a heterocosm. It has different rules, but because Teddy does in fact blush a couple times. But no, I mean there are melancholy characters in the new book, but none of them is quite like Cuddles. There's even another literary artist, Rex Amerisaurus, who writes epic verse. he has a sense of the grand and the grandiose and the epic. So he's not as fixated on tragic melancholy as Cuttles was, but he's got some of the same pretensions. No, Auguste is melancholy in a different way. It's not sort of cosmic dissatisfaction, although he does say that he's not overly fond of the universe at one point because he finds it impertinent. But more because he senses that the standards of the society around him are in decay. That is, he's an emperor penguin, and so he has a kind of high, imperious
Yeah.
sense of how things should be.
Well,
And there's, of course,
as any emperor penguin must have, probably.
and there are a pair of horses, twins, brother and sister, and the brother is a little bit on the morose side at times, but there's a history there, and it gets better by the end. So so yes, these characters are not all cheerful, but they're all good-hearted and kind. I think, and when we wrote the first book, I don't want to give away the ending, but I think that Gorilla's final response to what is revealed about the mystery is
and yeah,
actually,
his response was great, especially considering that what was taken, a paperclip necklace.
well, they left
Others
that.
would have difficult time forgiving such a heinous crime.
Yeah, they didn't take the paperclip necklace.
Did they not take the
treasure? No, that's the one thing
this.
they left behind.
Oh, I just remember this.
That
For
was
some
all
reason,
he cared about, really.
Okay. I do remember the paperclip. Yeah.
Yes. Now you're
Okay, well, then no wonder he was
forgive.
able to forgive. I mean, but that
No,
would
no,
test,
no.
that
He would have
test
forgiven
Gorilla's.
that too. I think we see that his capacity for, you see, now you've given away too much in the ending already. But his goodness.
I'll edit this down so I'll have the kid version so they can catch the main point, and then the full version later. And I'll put the links to the books in the description so people can go and click on them and peruse.
Yeah. No, I think that the good. I myself am very fond of the character of Gorilla, and see, one of the reason I can do that without being overly, without praising myself as an author, is that it was collaborative in that sense. There's a lot of the toys in the books have the personalities in part that they were endowed with by my son when he was a child and was just making up games with me. These games, these two books came from games that we played. The next one we're going to write, we have to come up with a new plot for because we only had two games that were fully played out to the end originally. But in which I would create a kind of mystery. We'd have his soft toys, his stuffed animals around his head, and would create clues and you'd follow them. But in following them, he also had this, imaginative world. These toys had personalities. I mean, the children are, again, I say they're natural geniuses. They're natural creative geniuses too. If you let them, they will infuse inanimate things with very particular personalities and quirks of personality and idiosyncrasies and special kinds of wisdom or folly. And so I can say that I like the characters of the books quite a lot, and I'm very fond of Gorilla. He's a to me, it's a sort of cynical phase. Yes. I aspire to be more like him in temperament, if not necessarily intellect.
That's very true. There's what he lacks in intelligence, he makes up for in heart, and I think we can.
That's the point of the book. I mean, he's the hero in the end because of his.
As it says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Well, Dr. Hart, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you very much. And anyone who's watching, you can purchase and should purchase The Mystery of Castle MacGorilla and its sequel, The Mystery of the Green Star. I think you will enjoy them as much as I have. And Dr. Hart, thank you very much for your time.